Welcome to the Philadelphia chapter of Inform's virtual speaker session. This is our third one of the season. I am honored to have a colleague and a person who I consider as a friend be our speaker tonight, Dr. Erick Wikum. I first met Dr. Wikum, about 26 years ago. So which means that I've known him for almost all of his 30 years of practice of operations research and analytics. We both met when we were doing operations research for railways. We were at different companies at that time, but the railroad industry was very welcoming to joint work. After Eric left the railroad, he went on and became both internal and external consultants for a variety of organizations doing really tough modeling in the trucking, logistics, retail, and even the agribusiness. That's hard to pronounce. Eric has also been a very active Informs member, recently serving as president and subdivisions council representative of the Analytics Society. He's an associate editor of the Informs Journal of Applied Analytics and is slated to serve as general chair of the 2022 Informs Business and Analytics Conference. Eric earned his master's and PhD degrees in OR from Georgia Tech and his bachelor's in math and OR from the U.S. Air Force Air Force Academy. Please welcome Dr. Wikum and his talk about a recipe for analytics success. Basically, the 10 things that he learned that we can now benefit from. So thank you. And I will stop my share. Eric?
Okay. 1 second here. I'll start sharing and then I'll get started. All right. Can everyone see my title slide there? Okay, good. Well, welcome everyone. Thanks very much, Mark, for that nice introduction. I appreciate it. I'm really excited to share with you some of the important lessons that I've learned over the course of my analytics career. One of the important principles that I've learned in practicing analytics is what you see on this card here. And that is that it matters not just what you do, but how you do it. And I've especially been attracted to this second point of how you do analytics. So on the portion that is what you do, I think of that as being applying various techniques, descriptive, predictive, and prescriptive analytics, using optimization, simulation, statistics, machine learning, AI, the list goes on and on. Writing code using various languages, utilizing software tools for data manipulation and querying, modeling, visualization, etc. So these are all the really technical skills that we develop and that we apply to do analytics. But the how you do it consists of things like framing the problem to make sure that you identify the right problem and a problem that matters and is worth addressing. It also involves things like consulting skills to structure and bring discipline to the approach that you're taking, and project management to be able to deliver quality deliverables on time and on budget. So the lessons I'm going to share with you are not so much technical things. In fact, I'm not going to talk about technical things at all. I'm going to share with you some of the things that will help you to do well in some analytics projects, but also in your analytics career and in your life overall. So here's a visual that shows my career path. As Mark mentioned, I went to the Air Force Academy. And then after that, I was fortunate enough to be able to attend Georgia Tech immediately after the Air Force Academy. It was my first assignment in the Air Force. And during grad school, I really enjoyed theoretical things, and I did a dissertation that was quite theoretical in nature. I analyzed various problems, came up with some solution techniques, looked at NP completeness proofs and so forth. So I really enjoyed that. But when I left Georgia Tech and entered the Air Force, I went to Scott Air Force Base, which is in Illinois, not too far from St. Louis. And I really fell in love with real world problems. And what I liked about them is that there was this technical aspect. We had to figure out how to deal with data and the mathematics, but there were a lot of other hurdles that you had to clear as well. So for example, you had to have someone champion the work, and you ultimately had to convince people that results that you had obtained would be something that they should consider. I've often said in my career that people problems are the hardest problems that we'll ever solve. So it's very rewarding, I found, if you can clear all of those hurdles, not just technical hurdles, but everything else, and actually get something implemented that adds value and makes people's lives better. When I left the Air Force, then I joined the Industrial Engineering and Operations Research Group at Norfolk Southern Railroad in Atlanta. And after that, I left to join Schneider, and that is a trucking and logistics company headquartered in Green Bay, Wisconsin. So I was there for nearly 10 years. And after a while, I decided that I wanted to hang out a shingle as an independent consultant. So I left Schneider and I formed my own company. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about that later in the presentation. After that, I joined IBM as a consultant in a newly formed analytics group within global business or global consulting services. And then when I left IBM, I joined Tata Consultancy Services, which is an IT service provider, very large company headquartered in India. And I served in a research role, but I worked closely with a group who was doing client engagements in the supply chain area. And then in January of 2017, I had a chance again to go out on my own. And that is what I've been doing ever since. I formed a company that I called Wikalytics LLC. So one of the things that you can see is I've had quite a few different work experiences. And sometimes I wonder a little bit about whether or not it might have been better to be patient and stay in one place. There's a lot of companies that reward longevity, give people a chance to advance over time. I think that can be a good career path for someone else. When I look at it, the thing that I really look at is that I value the diversity of roles, industries, and organizational and even international cultures that I've experienced in my career journey. So I think that by seeing a number of different companies that I've really valued from this diversity. In the consulting industry, they sometimes say there's a revolving door So in the consulting industry, it's not uncommon for people to come and go pretty frequently, but in other industries, it may be frowned upon. And in fact, it would make sense for an employer to look at someone who is changing jobs like a ping pong ball to be kind of a risk. Why would I want to hire you, invest in training you only to have you leave to find some greener pasture? So this question of whether or not one should stay put or look for a diversity of experiences, I think is a complicated one. And I think it's an individual decision to make. But I'll tell you, for my part, I've really valued the overall experience and that I've had. This is really how my career started. When I was in high school, I did several brief stints for a local farmer. And the first thing I did, which is pictured on top, is called walking beans. When a farmer plants beans, in this case, red kidney beans, in a field that had previously had corn, then you get what is called volunteer corn that comes up from seed left from the previous year. And so you get these groups of people out in the hot sun. They walk up and down the rows across field after field. So I did this for about 2 weeks. It was very grueling work. And you walk around with a hoe and you basically take out the corn plants so that the quality of the harvest will be good and not be contaminated with corn. The second picture on the lower left is something I did one night. It was a very, very cold night in Wisconsin. And I went out with a number of other people and we basically picked chickens for market. And so what we had to do is to grab several of them and then we would carry them over to a truck where they put them into some cages. And this work was quite something. So first of all, with many thousands of chickens, the building was very warm. It also had a very, very strong smell of ammonia, which was almost overwhelming. And then, as I mentioned, it was a very cold night. So every time I went to the truck, I would get my lungs filled with cold air. And I ended up having a, I guess, undiagnosed case of pneumonia. Then one summer day, I did sundry tasks for the farmer, including loading bags of kidney beans onto a truck. And after many times with basically sweaty arms and sliding these beans onto the truck, I had a rug burn that was just excruciatingly painful for a number of days after that. So what I learned through this whole experience is that I gained a healthy respect, I think, for people who earn their living through physical labor. But I was mentioning that I had been enrolled in Calculus 3. I was very proud of that. And when I went to take my first exam, then I was surprised to find the message you see here written on my paper. And I had not done well at all. So I made an appointment to see Captain James. And when I talked to him, I explained to him that I had done well in high school, but I really wasn't sure how I would fit in at the Air Force Academy. When I arrived, my classmates and I had been told that we might be good in our own high school, our own state, but now we were mixed in with people from 50 states and we may or may not measure up. We were also told that probably 1/3 of us would not be able to graduate from the academy. We would wash out for one reason or another. So I kind of had my doubts, and I don't remember the exact conversation I had with Captain James, but he helped me turn to the point where I was confident that I could succeed. And I went on and did quite well. So this point of encouragement is what I'm starting with, and it's something we all can do, especially during this time of COVID. There are a lot of people who are in need of encouragement, students, faculty members, people working everywhere. And so as far as in our careers, it can make a huge difference like it did for me. It literally just set me on the right path. So what I would like to do is encourage all of you to look for opportunities to encourage others. Okay. Ted Gifford, with whom I used to work at Schneider, was fond of saying, "I've forgotten more than you know." Now that phrase can be used as kind of a put down for people who say, like, I know things so well that the things you consider to be basic are things that I don't even think about. But Ted really used it in a self-deprecating way to say that he literally had forgotten so much of what he had learned through the years. When I look back at all the courses I took in undergraduate and graduate school, I too find that it's amazing how many things that I never used and I have very poor retention of. And when we look at our education system, it's often drinking from a fire hose, taking many courses at once, and often the best we can do is really learn the material well enough to take the test. So there was one point in my career where I set out to learn how to program using C. And I had a textbook and it had examples in it. So I went through all of these things. And I found that in the end, I didn't really retain that much of it. This past summer, I was given the task of taking over an optimization algorithm that was written in Java. And I not only had to understand the Java code, but I had to do some enhancements. So necessity was the mother of invention. There was a timeline and something I needed to do. And I was able to learn Java, learn this application, and deliver the application in time. And I can tell you that when I actually had to use the knowledge and not just learn it, then it's something that I now own. I now know how to program in Java up to some level, and I know this application. So the lesson here is it's fine to go out and learn things, attend training sessions and so forth, but unless you use it, and the best place to use it is on an actual project, that's how you ultimately own the knowledge. When I was newly minted PhD, I really looked at myself as being someone who solved problems, who used a lot of math, and I knew how to program, but I didn't really consider programming to be really my main focus. And I kind of just looked at computer science as being something I should know well enough to get by, because it was important to be able to program things, to be able to write code, to look at data and so forth. But through the years, I really have come to believe that you can't ever be good enough at programming. So that is an area that you should invest in. You also, given the importance of data and what we do, you really can't have enough skills at using things like SQL or Hadoop or whatever you need to fetch data, to analyze data, to compile data. So the lesson here is you may not be a computer programmer, but those skills are something that you should develop, and the work that you put into that will pay great dividends in your career. When I arrived at Scott Air Force Base, I joined an analysis group within the headquarters of Air Mobility Command. Air Mobility Command is responsible for cargo planes that transport things around the world. And the group there had developed a very large simulation. It took many hours to run, and it could simulate the movement of troops and material moved by aircraft through various airfields. And getting the material from typically the US to where it was needed in some kind of a, say, a battle scenario. So that group was posed with a question, and that question was, how many of the then new C-17 aircraft should the Air Force, or did the Air Force need? A classmate of mine from the Air Force Academy arrived to Scott, and he was in the right place at the right time. He applied, he had just finished his master's degree, and he applied response surface methodology, and he used Excel's new capabilities at the time of pivot tables and pivot charts and 3D charts to be able to help people visualize the solution. So he was able to help the group use its simulation and to make runs and to kind of come up with a conclusion of the number of C-17s that the Air Force should buy. And he, as I mentioned, he was in the right time. He caught this huge wave, and before you know it, he was going almost weekly to Washington with the generals to brief the top brass on this decision. When I looked at his approach initially, I thought, well, this isn't that incredible here. It's easy to understand what you're doing with these methods. And so I was focused on how sophisticated or how complex his solution was. And that's something that we often do, is that we look at our work and we say, well, how hard was this to do this? Or how clever were we in manipulating data or applying optimization? We also might look at the complexity of what we've implemented. But when we think about business people, they don't really care about that. They don't understand that. They don't appreciate that amount of work. And often we find that the solutions that we think are incredible are not really embraced by business people. On the other hand, we put together some solutions which we consider to be kind of simple, and they may not have taken very much time, but for some reason, they really resonate with people. And so the lesson here is that if you catch a wave, in other words, you spur the interest of decision makers, don't question why, but just ride the wave. Every MBA knows that M&A stands for mergers and acquisitions. But when I have it here on this slide, I'm referring to something else, which is modeling and analysis. It's really, I've really come to understand that modeling and analysis are two very different things. They require different skill sets. And so let me tell you a little story about how I first came to realize this. While I was at Norfolk Southern Railroad, I led a team of about 10 people to develop a simulation model of a new rail facility. And we spent a lot of time putting together this model, and we also put together a really nice set of ways to be able to load inputs and outputs and to visualize them all in one package. And after months of really intense effort, we were done. Our simulation model was all ready to go. And we were faced with an unexpected tough challenge. And that challenge was to now figure out what we were going to do with this model. We had the model, but we were not entirely clear about the questions that we should be addressing with that model. We didn't know if we even had put the right outputs in the model to answer the questions that would come up. So for me, that was a real wake-up call in seeing that developing a model is not the end of the story. The end of the story is being able to use that model to address questions, and that involves analysis. So when we think about modeling, and I'm especially thinking about optimization and simulation modeling, we focus on some kind of a system. And we have to look at things like, well, what are the boundaries of the system? What are some of the things that we that we need to or might not include in the model, depending on the level of granularity. We look at what data are needed, but also what data are available to aid in developing the model. How can our system be abstracted into some kind of representation? How can we then code that representation and verify that it is correct, and then validate that the model produces results which are consistent with what we would expect in the real world? So all of those things are skills and questions that we have to answer through modeling. When we look at analysis, it concerns using data to explain and interpret and to draw conclusions, to really tease out the story that the data is telling us. In that sense, when we think about statistical modeling, it's much closer to analysis, because it helps us to do things like recognize relationships, trends, patterns, outliers that might exist and be significant. So as an analyst, we're trying to use data to draw conclusions. And then we also, very importantly, must decide how we can convey or communicate those conclusions to decision makers. So this is a really big area. There's a whole lot to be said about modeling and analysis and the difference between the two. But what I'd like you to do is to understand and recognize that these two things are very different. They involve very different skills. And as you pursue developing your skill set, make sure that you pay attention not just to modeling, but also to the skills that will aid you in being able to do effective analysis. The next thing I learned, and I think my time at IBM was really invaluable for this, is the importance of consulting and the skills that consultants use. The most of what I learned, I really learned from people, not necessarily analytics consultants, but other consultants I was working with who were very skilled in these things. And by observing what they were doing, I learned a very large amount of really important skills. So consultants provide advice, of course, but one of the important things that they bring to the table are some methods that provide for a disciplined and structured approach to solving a problem. So I've worked in a number of companies internally, and what I've shown there in the right-hand corner is what is often the way that companies go about doing analytics, which I call doing stuff. They don't necessarily plan for what it is that they're trying to deliver, how long it's going to take. They just jump in and start coding, start analyzing data, and usually some good things come out of it, but not necessarily. So this structured approach involves things like doing a proposal or a statement of work so that we know what it is that we're about and what we're going to do. Carefully defining deliverables. Consultants are very focused on what is it that we're going to deliver, and also then when are we going to deliver it, and specifically what are those deliverables going to be. Project management involves developing not only a plan, it involves estimating the amount of resources that are needed, and it involves actually executing the project, identifying issues that arise and addressing them, identifying risks and addressing them, and modifying the plan as needed based on what's happening. There's also, in the selling area, one of the things that a partner at IBM taught me, which I think is a very useful thing for everyone, whether you're working inside or as a consultant, is that when the door is open to you to work with an organization, you get to see what they're about. And as you do one project, then when you finish, you should have an idea of what the other opportunities are and be ready to propose additional value add work that you can now do because you've been allowed to open the door and see what's available there. Working inside of an organization, you may have a title like data scientist, or you might be an engineer or an analyst. What I would like to encourage you to do is to think of yourself as an internal consultant. And along with that, develop and utilize consulting skills. One of the most important end games for a consultant is to be thought of as a trusted advisor. That is someone who is really invited to the table when important things are being discussed. So whether you're inside of a company or outside of a company working as a consultant, that's really a sign of success, is when your clients invite you to discuss what their plans, they invite you to the table as a trusted advisor. The next thing that I found that I think is a good way to think about a career path is to first go deep in your career and then to think about going wide. So consulting companies usually define what they call industry verticals. So those are a single industry or group of industries that they provide services for. So one example might be the financial services industry, or the travel, transportation, hospitality industry, or the manufacturing industry. So early in your career, it's good to get into an industry and learn who are the players, what are the concepts that are present in that industry, what is the terminology that is used, what are the challenges that the industry players face, what kind of problems do they have that can be solved, what kind of data do they have. So that getting a deep understanding of an industry, I think really goes along with also developing consulting or developing your technical skills. And coming out of school, there are a lot of things to learn about how do you really apply this thing, how do you program, how do you deal with data, how do you use modeling software of various sorts. Once you've developed into an expert, both applying analytics and understanding an industry, then it can be very rewarding to take that and to apply it to other industries. Consulting companies would refer to analytics as a horizontal. That is, it's a set of methods that apply across different industries. One of the things that you then can learn to do as you move into new industries is that you need to be able to pick up the concepts, the lingo, very quickly. And we already know the analytics techniques, but we can then match those to that new industry. In my career, I've found it very rewarding and interesting, especially in the last several years, to really branch out into some additional industries. When I started working at Norfolk Southern, I was assigned to a project, and within just a week or two of starting, I had a conversation with my boss, and he gave me a huge wake-up call. He said, "I just don't feel like you're willing to roll up your sleeves and get your hands dirty." And I understood what he said. I was kind of hesitant to get involved with things. I was trying to kind of wait and see. And I decided at that point that I would do whatever it takes so that no one would ever think that of me again. I've been blessed throughout my career to work with some really great programmers. And one in particular had a background in mathematics as well as programming. and he would take kind of a rough outline that I would produce, and he would produce some really great code, something that I was definitely not capable of producing, very quickly. And the other thing is that he would correct my errors in logic along the way as he did it. So that was, I looked at that as a real blessing, to have someone who would do that for me so that I didn't have to. But as I've gone through that, I've always been willing, if I did not have that luxury of having someone else, to be the person who did the programming. And as we look at this field of analytics, actually getting through to success requires, first of all, there is some sexy aspect to it. Perhaps most of us think that's the mathematics that we work through to do that. But to get to that, there's a lot of really mundane work that we have to do, especially data analysis and data munging. It's not necessarily very fun at all. It's very time consuming. But if you're going to get to the end game, somebody has to do it. And again, it's a luxury if you have somebody that can help you with that. But if you don't, then you should be willing to do that as well. So the bottom line here is that to be successful in an analytics career, you don't necessarily need to do anything, but being willing to do it and being willing to roll up your sleeves and be the person to do that work, to get your team through to the other side and to success is a really great quality to have, a real sense of humility. When I joined Norfolk Southern, I experienced a few individuals in the department who were targeted for a corporate buyout. When I first heard that, I was fresh out of school, and I'm thinking, that sounds like they just want to save money, and they're not really valuing the contributions that these individuals have made over time. But as I thought about it more and I kind of observed things, I realized that to some extent, these folks were frozen in time. Their skill sets were limited and had not really evolved to some of the more modern tools. And they were really limited in what the projects they could do because they weren't able to do certain things. And I also found that not only were their skill sets frozen in time, but so were their wardrobes. So when I looked at that, it impressed on me the need to always be on the grow. It's important that we continue to learn new techniques, new skills. And as all of you know, the field is changing very rapidly. There's new techniques all the time. It's very difficult to stay up with those, but we at least need to be moving forward and growing in our careers. To misquote Ferris Bueller, life moves pretty fast. If you don't keep your skills up to date, you might turn to ice, or worse yet, you might end up wearing leisure suits. I mentioned when I was showing you my career path that I was going to talk a little bit more about my experience with my own company. So when I left Schneider, it was August 28th, 2008. And less than 2 weeks later, Lehman Brothers failed and the Great Depression was on. So I tried to find clients, and I contacted people, I went and talked to people, but at that time, companies were hemorrhaging their own employees, and no one was really willing to take on a consultant. I also realized in retrospect that I didn't really know how to sell myself. I was trying to do some cold calling. And if you have to explain to people what analytics is or what operations research is, you have virtually no chance of being able to sell them any sort of services. And so in the course of 18 months, I made $32,000 of revenue. My 3 kids refused to stop eating. And so at one point then I was fortunate to be able to latch on with IBM, and IBM was hiring aggressively ahead of the recovery. And they put together a really strong team of people who were available in the marketplace. As I mentioned earlier, my experience at IBM and learning consulting skills was very valuable to me. And when I had a chance several years later to go out on my own again, the really tough part of that was mostly the memory of my first experience, and not only for me, but for my family who lived through that time as well. So fortunately, when I started my latest company, the economy was better. I've been able to find work, knock on wood. But this whole experience of, I guess, really getting back in the saddle and trying again has been painful, but it's also been very valuable to me personally. The picture you see there on the right shows me finishing my first American Birkebeiner cross-country ski marathon. It's about it's more than a 30-mile race that's held in northern Wisconsin. And on the left is my son. Just this past week, I did my 17th Birkebeiner ski race virtually. I actually ran because that was an option. And my son is just 2 months away from graduating from college. So that's been quite a while that I've been involved with that. When you're doing long distance events, inevitably you reach a point where your mind starts questioning whether or not you can finish. And my experience of being able to quiet that voice and push through again and again has been very valuable to me, not only in athletic endeavors, but also in my work life. During this past year, I had my son and a daughter at home, and they got me into watching Shark Tank. I found if you watch that show, that the services and the products that the contestants have are really exciting. But for me, the most interesting part of that show are the stories that both the contestants and the sharks have to tell about their early careers and really struggling and failing and trying again. So if you'd like to have a little bit way to learn this, I encourage you to watch some episodes of Shark Tank, and inevitably you'll hear about how entrepreneurs get back in the saddle despite the pain. So here's a list of these 10 lessons that I've shared with you. I'm going to give you a minute to kind of look over the list. And I don't know if you realize by attending that you're actually going to get a bit of homework, but here's my homework for you. So first of all, number 1 is extremely easy to do, but it's vitally important. So what I'm going to ask you to do in the next week is to find someone that you can speak to encourage. As I mentioned before, students and faculty members and really everyone is in need of some encouragement these days. And then the other thing I'd like you to do is to look at the list of the other 9 and to pick one of these things that you can pursue in the next week or two. And in the spirit of use it to own it, I'd like you to figure out a concrete way that you can apply that lesson. So I'll give you another minute here And then we can turn to questions and answers. And if you haven't already done so, if you've got comments that you'd like to share, they don't have to be questions. I would welcome that as well. Okay, Maria, if you would like to share any questions that have come in, I'd be happy to address them. And here's my contact information if you'd like to follow up with me. And again, I would welcome sharing your experiences and your perspective on the lessons that I've learned, or maybe some lessons that you have that you would like to share with me. I welcome all of that.
Well, thank you, Eric. Thanks for a really interesting talk. I appreciate it that you took the time this evening to be here with us at the Philly Informs group. One question that came in early on, somebody asked whether we will record the session and make it available. It is being recorded. It will be sent to our participants who are here tonight and will be posted on our website as well. So feel free to check that out. So I'm inviting all the participants, please, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A box, and Eric is happy to answer any and all. And maybe I'll kick it off and ask some questions, since I'm in the teaching business, so I'll pretend I ask the questions for my students. What usually is on their mind, since I often talk to students in an advising role, they very often are concerned, you know, what is it that we should pursue while we are in an undergraduate program, let's say. They're interested in business analytics. What tools do you think they should pick up before they leave a place like Penn?
I think a exposure to a number of different things is helpful. I think I would think of going a little bit more broad than deep in these things, because there will be time to learn them later. So one thing would be programming language. If you look at general programming languages right now, Python and R are used very broadly in analytics. So one or both of those, having a familiarity with them. And then I think data tools are extremely helpful. So one basic thing is understanding how to use SQL. And then as far as other types of tools, if you look at optimization modeling, that have exposure to a math programming language to express an optimization problem, have exposure to a solver and understand kind of some of the parameters that are fed to, to various types of solvers. It's good to have exposure to some simulation package. I'm not going to mention any in particular, but there's some kind of market leading simulation packages that are available and that would be good to understand. And then on a statistical side, I think R has a really great library of various packages that can be used to do that sort of analysis. There's also some commercial software that's available, but I would say having a broad exposure to these things is helpful, because I don't think that they're going to have enough time to master any of these things, and I would rather see them pursue the ones that they have more deeply later, when they figure out which ones in particular they need right away.
Thank you. There was somebody else who asked kind of a follow-up question in that field, and that is any specific programming language. I think you mentioned R and Python in particular. You want to add anything to that?
Well, Java is used fairly widely. It's helpful to have an ability to use Excel effectively. It's not necessarily a heavy duty tool to deliver things, but it's good because a lot of business people use it. It's a way to deliver results, and there are some sophisticated things you can do with Excel, which may or may not be a good idea using VBA, but at least be very proficient using spreadsheet packages to be able to share things and to do calculations quickly and demonstrate things.
So going from these more technical skills, there are also questions about what are considered the soft skills. And somebody's asking here, are soft skills something that we can actually teach in school? Can students learn that? Or is it something that you just have to learn on the job?
I think that introducing it in the context of some kind of an applied project, perhaps a capstone project, or which could be in either a master's program or an undergraduate program, is a good place to introduce that. So things like having a project plan that has to be, mapped out at some level so that people understand how to do that. Specifically identifying the deliverables that you have. I don't see that as being like necessarily a course unto itself. I think that would be kind of hard to teach a course that is really academically rigorous to do that. And so I think a lot of it would be in the context of a more applied thing. That also could be, I guess the university could work with people who employ people as interns or as co-ops to try to make that part of that experience for them.
So since you have really straddled both sides, you have worked in big companies where, let's say at IBM or at the railroad, where you were not the only OR type person, and you have also run your own one-man consulting business. Do you have any recommendation for single person analytics teams? How do you stay motivated? Where do you exchange your ideas? So the question comes from the audience. Before I let Eric answer that, I'd love to offer an answer from the Phillies Informs chapter. We actually put this Philadelphia Informs chapter together with the purpose of giving everybody an opportunity to do some networking, to find other people that might be interested in talking about analytics problem, optimization problems, simulation problems, whatever it may be. But let's hear from our speaker here. Okay,
well, I echo the Informs angle. Over the last number of years, especially, I've been extremely active in Informs. And throughout my career, I found it to be a great home for me in terms of being able to interact with people both on a technical level and on a personal level as well. So it's a great source of motivation and value for me to be not only a member of Informs, but also a volunteer in many ways within Informs. I think the one thing about being a single person is that, I guess, first of all, you have to find work. So I mentioned the word cold calling before. That doesn't really work. And the second time around, I've really, I just kind of made people in my network aware that I was doing this, and I've been fortunate that they've picked up on that. And so the engagements I've done have actually been part of groups, some fairly large groups. So it's not like I'm going to a company and just doing my own project, but I've actually been interacting with a lot of people in that way. And one thing I had thought to mention earlier is that in that first go around, one of the things that really was helpful was for me to do networking. And LinkedIn was really just coming into the fore back in 2008, and I invested a lot of time in developing my network. And as a consultant, that has been very valuable. And I look at it not only as a place to interact with people and potentially to get help that I need, but it's also a great way to give back to people in your network as well.
Thank you. We have quite a few questions and I want to be mindful of time, so I'm just going to throw them at you rather quickly. How do you figure out what information to include to tell a story about the results of the study if you want to convince your listeners that they should follow your advice?
That's a good question. One of the words I like in that is story. Ultimately, telling stories to people is better than trying to. I think we're rational people. We often think that we can just, give the facts and that they'll speak for themselves, but we really need to weave that into a story that is interesting and enlightening to people. So I think effective visualization is very important in that. And I think being able to get feedback from people, it may not be the person that you're ultimately going to be presenting to, but others on what do you think about this chart? Does this speak to you, or this way of presenting this idea? So I think feedback is a useful thing there as well.
And here's a question on your going deep first and then horizontally with regard to industry experience. Would you apply this to skill sets as well as the question? Have you found it better to be a specialist or a generalist as far as your OR skills are concerned?
I think if you're going to be effective at anything, you have to go to a certain level of depth. So you could, let's say, be able to formulate some very simple optimization problems, but generally the problems that that we solve are complex enough that if you don't have a pretty solid basis in that, you're probably not going to be able to add much value. So I would say that you don't have to be the deepest, darkest expert in any of these things, but there is a level of capability that you need to develop that makes you useful in applying those things.
And one more specific question to your on your go-to tools. What are your go-to tools presently? Jupyter, AutoML, Postgres?
I guess first of all, when I use Python, I typically just use it in a very simple way through the kind of the default environments. I've played around a little bit with Jupyter notebooks. I think that they're effective at being able to kind of put together results, whether it's something that you're just trying to kind of keep track of the steps that you took in something, or in being able to generate a report. That is also, if you look at R, they have R Markdown language, which allows you to create kind of an HTML version that has your R code embedded in it and creates charts and other things. I would say on the programming, I use some Python, some R. On database, I've used a number of different database tools. I think the common denominator is SQL. And then I have some experience with quite a few different optimization programming languages and optimization solvers.
Yeah, you have quite a few tools in your toolbox. Last question for the evening before we let you go. Somebody is curious whether you believe in participating in data science competitions, like the Kaggle competition or something like that. Is that beneficial to improve real life experiences on real jobs?
I think it can be. When I look at myself, I am far too busy to have the time to do that, I think. But I think for some people it can be beneficial. One of the things for, let's say, undergrads or graduate students, I've seen a lot of people that have those experiences, and I think if you look at a resume of someone who just did their coursework and has now graduated, I think it adds a useful layer to have taken part in some of these competitions, because it is a real world like experience. It has commonality with that. And, but there's also volunteer efforts that can give you that type of experience. And I'll mention, for those of you who don't know about it, pro bono analytics, which is offered through Informs. So that would be an experience where you're actually having a chance to apply analytics for the benefit of a nonprofit organization, and being able to, again, not only gain that experience, but have that as something that you can share with others, that, no, I haven't had a job yet, but look what I've done as far as actual application of analytics.
I think that's a wonderful suggestion. And it's also a great note maybe to end up on, that we collectively use our skill sets and talents to make things a little bit better in the world. We all could use that, right? So I want to take just a second to thank you again, Eric, for a insightful presentation, for sharing your life's worth of experiences in our field. And to the audience, thank you for joining us this evening. I know everybody is suffering a little bit from Zoom fatigue, so I appreciate that you took the time before dinner, probably, to be here with us. If you don't know much about Informs, it's the Institute for Operations Research and Management Science. It's a leading international organization with more than 12,000 members. And here in Philadelphia, we have a much smaller chapter of professionals that we try to connect with each other, to exchange ideas, to learn from each other. So we organize webinars. We hopefully will have some in-person events at some time in the near future. So do check us out. We have a website, just Google Informs Philadelphia, and you'll find us. Drop us a note, send us suggestions of topics you're interested in. And thanks again for coming tonight.